Hey, folks, it is the first month of the year, 2021, January the 8th. And this is our U.S. history dual credit over, it's actually over the first semester. We're just still wrapping it up. And this is the Cold War, the last lecture for it. And so here we have an image of John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. This is before one of the very famous first televised presidential debates. We've been having them ever since. So before this time, debates were over radio. It was based on whoever had the best argument, maybe the best speaking voice, right? But now people are going to be judged based on their looks. And poor Nixon, not really born a pretty man, was like really serious, like pretty ill right before the debate. Apparently he was all sweaty. His debate team didn't know that when you go on TV, you're supposed to wear makeup to not make yourself look all shiny and sweaty and nervous. He apparently just had a bad day. So
That's unfortunate.
John Fitzgerald Kennedy, JFK, entered the 1960 presidential race running against Vice President Richard Nixon. Both candidates ran on very similar platforms. And that's true. Back then, Republicans and Democrats weren't that different. I mean, some Democrats at the time were still pushing for racial segregation and stuff like that, the Southern Democrats. But really and truly, the nation was kind of on the same side on a lot of things back then. So much of what determined the outcome of the election, the candidate appealed to voters. It's a personality test, who looked the most presidential. This election featured the first televised debate between two presidential candidates. Though many listeners through radio, because a lot of people still had radios instead of TVs, right, believe that Nixon won the debate, most voters had television. So a lot of people might have listened to the debate on the radio, might have been through in their car, while at work and stuff like that. Those who viewed the debate via television were more impressed with JFK as he appeared more youthful and confident, while Nixon had just overcome an illness and appeared to be disheveled. So, big thing about that, JFK, 1960, running for president, more popular than Nixon. But that's going to set a precedent. I mean, it's going to be, just physical appearance is now going to be something. Now
Unless
people,
they're both just like old men.
yeah, and that happens, but people are still fickle. We still judge with our eyes. I mean, even back George Washington's time, people would write about how he just looked like he should be like a king. Like they said when he rode in the saddle, he just had like a stature about him. He had they call it his continence, like his ability to not show emotion. It looked like a marble statue, like he was calm while other people were panicking. So like that's just one of those things that people always thought about for presidents, I mean, whereas on the flip side, Thomas Jefferson was known as being a terrible public speaker. He was a great author, but his voice is really squeaky and nobody liked listening to him. And he was kind of like, he just wasn't a very personable person. And Madison was super shy and stuff like that. So, wait, what? So we all know that JFK won. And of course, here at this inauguration, there's Eisenhower leaving office. There's his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson. And there's Nixon, the exiting vice president.
Lyndon B. Johnson looks like a corpse already.
Yeah, he's actually going to be first president from Texas.
Mm-hmm.
Right
Yay, Texas president because he is president.
Because his boss died. Yeah.
His boss died in Texas.
Yeah. Ooh, conspiracy. All right. Kennedy won the presidency by a narrow margin over Nixon, despite the vice president's executive experience. So he's a new kid on the block, but people thought, hey, fresh face. Is Kennedy in your the thing?
Was it during Kennedy and Nixon that people liked Kennedy more because those watching saw that he was relaxed, but Nixon was like sweating?
Yes, that's exactly what we were talking about while you were out there. Yeah. So, well, I'm glad you already knew it. So Kennedy is going to enter office as the youngest president. He's going to be, he grows up a rich kid. His father was a pretty well-to-do man, but during the Great Depression, through some very wise business investments, he invested for the long term because Kennedy's father figured that America would get back on its feet one day. So he bought a lot of business assets of failed businesses and held on to them until the country turned around. Then their value skyrocketed. He turned the companies around, and he was one of the richest people on earth. He just kind of waited until things got better, right? And so Kennedy would inherit that. He called for Americans to consider, ask not what your country do for you, ask what you can do for your country during his inaugural speech. And there's going to be another one of those on the 20th. And so that will be a historical thing. Wait, what day of the week is the 20th? Anybody know? What day of the week is the 20th? Yeah, let me look at the calendar thing. Because I'm curious if it's during a school day or not. Isn't it normally a Tuesday?
Wait, ask not what your country would do for
I think
you,
it's on a
but what you can do
Wednesday.
for your country.
I think it's on the
Yeah. Here. You think it's on a Wednesday? I thought it was on. I thought they normally do these things on Tuesdays because voting is always on a Tuesday. You're right. It is a Wednesday, and that is an A day. We might just, if it's during class time, we might just listen to it. It's probably going to happen before this class time. All right. So back to this. So, questions answered. All right. All right, so let's see here. Okay. As JFK took office, the civil rights movement was intensifying as college students began sit-ins at local restaurants for service at restaurants that refused to serve African Americans. So you'd have black kids and their white friends go up to restaurants that denied African Americans service at the counter, like they'd have order their food to go and stuff like that, or eat in a separate room, and they would sit until they were waited on. And during this time, usually people come up and harass them, beat them up, dump drinks on them, throw stuff at them, call them wordy dirts and stuff. It was a form of civil disobedience, of nonviolent protest, a very American thing, right? Sit-ins spread throughout 140 cities across the nation. So, and this was a young people movement, right? So it was like a lot of younger folks who were going around the nation trying to make change. And that kind of makes sense because, if somebody grows up in a system, sometimes it's harder to see the negativity in it. Young people are more risk taking too, and to make change takes risk, whether it's wanting a good change or a bad change. Meanwhile, 1961, a group of civil rights activists known as the Freedom Riders began to make a bus ride from Washington, D.C. to Alabama and Mississippi to protest segregation. This was a widely publicized event where they're going to have people of both races go ahead, hop on a Greyhound bus, and break these rules of bus segregation, like sitting on different parts of the bus and stuff like that. But just show that, hey, we can do it and you can't stop us. Yeah, it's going to turn out a little bit. So, yeah.
What, I didn't really understand what a sit-in was.
Okay, so let's say Julissa has a restaurant. And it's a segregated restaurant. Shame on you, Julissa. All right, and you're going to college, and you and your black friends are like, hey, we're going to protest the fact that Julissa won't let us have milkshakes together. So the two of you just go sit at the bar at the milkshake place and say, we're going to sit here until you give us milkshakes, or at least let us buy milkshakes. And so Julissa's terrible waitress won't give you the milkshake, so you just sit there for hours. And you're like, I'm not leaving until I get served. And then, of course, other customers might come up and harass you, and be like, hey, what are you doing that for? So it's a form of nonviolent protest. So it's kind of like, I'm trying to think of something like that in modern terms, right? Because there's because I can't think of anything like a sit-in recently, You might say that some people might be doing something like that for, like in some places where they wouldn't let churches like meet at all. People would still go to church anyways in large groups, even though like they're getting fined heavily and stuff. I saw in New York, like some churches and Jewish synagogues and stuff getting
There
heavy
was
fines.
there was a gym that did that.
Yeah, there's a gym. Yeah, that one New Jersey gym. But even churches, like some churches have had fines in tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of dollars in New York and parts of California for meeting and congregating, in large groups.
Yeah.
And stuff like that.
Which,
So
I mean-
you could think that could be something like that,
Yeah,
because
it's something that you see as like an encroachment on your rights.
Yeah, and it's not violent.
And it's not violent.
Yeah.
And they can't really do anything about it.
Yeah, but you still might, instead of the patrons harassing you, which
Right.
I could have. It's the all.
Yes.
All right, moving on. Oh, there we go. Well, the Freedom Riders, of course, would be attacked as they rode to D.C. As Freedom Riders traveled on, they faced increased violence, especially when it reached Birmingham, Alabama. Of course, Alabama is where a lot of stuff, like Montgomery, Birmingham, is where a lot of this highly televised early civil rights protest and anti-protest violence would happen. In 1963, Martin Luther King and many others held protest marches in Birmingham, only to be beaten and arrested by the authorities. So remember, when we're talking about the South, we have legal forms of racism, Jim Crow laws and stuff like that. Whereas in other parts of the country, it wouldn't be legal in the form of law, but it could still be matter of fact. JFK sent 3,000 soldiers to Birmingham to keep order. So we've already seen that the president was set with Eisenhower to use U.S. troops to desegregate schools and to provide safety for Black students. Here, John F. Kennedy is doing the same thing. Two separate parties, same goal though. That same year, Martin Luther King Jr. and others organized the March on Washington of up to 250,000 people. That was super big at the time. The largest gathering in American history up to that point. Of course, there have been larger movements and meetings in Washington since then. You have like the Women's March group, you have the pro-life march groups. There has been even larger civil rights groups and stuff like that. So, and of course, the whole thing like earlier in the week. So, development on intercontinental ballistic missiles. This is not not civil rights. This is like going back to international stuff. So, during this time, however, the thing is too, while all this is going on, the Soviets are like rubbing it in our face. They're like, ha ha ha, you evil capitalists, look at you. You're even racist too. And so a lot of people were kind of scared that the Soviets would actually use our racial disharmony against us to like not only to make us look like fools to the rest of the world, which the rest of the world didn't like what was going on. Of course, the rest of the world had their own stuff going on too. But also there was a fear that certain racial groups might be used by Soviets against America. So there was you even had some civil rights groups were being spied on by the FBI and stuff, just to make sure they weren't going to join the Russians. All right, so development on intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, led to the ability to launch nuclear weapons into orbit, and then they re-enter the orbit on the other side of the world. We weren't really able to track these things. Once it went straight up into space, it was off our radars. And then it would re-enter orbit just above its target and detonate. Of course, at a certain range, like they would detonate these things at different levels for different purposes. But for the most part, that was scary to basically have like a nuclear spaceship, like a big super weapon like that. And so we already talked about that the A-bomb was small stuff. Now the nukes were much more big and powerful. And so now that they're untraceable and they can just happen anywhere to where we can hardly defend ourselves other than push the button and launch some at them, all of a sudden the term MAD, mutually assured destruction, was more and more of a reality. So you have a world that's like on the trigger. And so, are we move on?
Okay, nice point.
Hey, but one cool thing during this time, besides just sending up like super death rockets up into space, we're also sending up people. And so, it's my understanding this flag's now bleached white because of solar radiation. It's just like a white flag now. Another thing, I think China actually just recently planted a People's Republic of China flag on the moon. So
They went to the moon recently?
yeah. Of course, we're talking about sending astronauts back to the moon soon.
And as like practice for Mars.
Yes, as practice for Mars, exactly. And it would be a good launch point if we could do something like store fuel and stuff like that
As
on
well
the
as
moon.
use it to, I believe what they're gonna do is they're gonna use the moon to slingshot towards the,
That makes a lot of sense.
towards the,
Mars.
towards Mars.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because a lot of using gravity of like the Earth and stuff like that is a big part of, or even other planets for like probes and satellites going out into space. Using gravity and all that stuff to slingshot is very important. Now, let's get your hand up first. What's up?
How long does it take to get to the moon?
Man, I don't know, like a few days. I'm not 100%. Yes, sir. Yeah, go ahead. It's worth the Google though. So, yeah, yeah. I mean, the hard part's getting out into space. After that, supposedly, yeah, like you hardly need any fuel at all to like move on further
No, you really don't.
because there's no resistance. You just go.
The only difficulties are oxygen.
Mhm.
Because they need lots of oxygen.
The return trip.
The return trip is.
How you gonna get off Mars? I mean, that's a doozy. They don't. That's.
It's gonna be really difficult.
If we
Mars
can get-
doesn't have as much of an atmosphere though.
It doesn't, and it's got a little less gravity, but still, I mean, that's like,
You're gonna need almost as much.
yeah.
And what I'm thinking is what they could do,
Mhm.
what they might just do is they'll, once they're on Mars,
Mhm.
or a little bit after they leave, they will send an unmanned craft
Mhm.
towards, that same direction, following the same course,
With some Gojus.
with some coaches. And
Yeah.
some other
Well,
resources.
It would be really nice if we could find a non-energy intensive way to exit atmospheres.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't get it because
Do you know the fastest object that we've ever made? The fastest man-made object ever to move?
what?
A manhole cover. Because we detonated a nuclear bomb in this massive shaft underground. When we blew it up, a scientist was like, it'd be a great idea if we just put like a manhole cover on it.
Huh.
And so that manhole cover moved so quickly, it happened in like the 50s. It moved so quickly that nobody saw what happened to it at all. Nobody saw where it went because it went so far into space so fast.
It must have been like a
And then later they did the same thing again. And then
Please tell me they put a tracker on that one.
they used a high-speed camera. I'm pretty sure the tracker would have burnt up. They used a high-speed camera
And they still
to
couldn't see it?
track it. They could see it for like 2 frames.
That had to be plasma.
Yeah.
That had to just,
Yeah, they used it for like 2 frames, and later scientists came back and were like, okay, so it's going this fast. It had enough time to get out of the atmosphere before it burnt up, and now it's probably past Pluto.
Oh my gosh.
So that's the fastest
that
thing.
stopped those aliens.
Just shoot
Wait,
manhole
it's-
covers with nukes and all the aliens.
There you go.
What the crap was
Totally on
our
your feet.
fleet on?
Oh yeah, back to the space race. Ever since the Soviets' success with the launch of the first successful satellite in space, Sputnik, in 1957, America felt the need to beat the Russians in space exploration. And the Russians were doing, they really were ahead of the game. They even sent the first living creature up in the moon too, a dog. And so,
That was a monkey. we send the monkey or did they send?
I think they did both, but I think it was a dog.
I think
The
they
dog
sent
was
the
first.
monkey and then we sent the man.
But I remember I was listening to
You only have seen.
this one historian. He was talking about, oh yeah, back in the 50s, people were freaking out because like it was something like 7 times an hour above their house, they knew there was a dead dog like orbiting over the earth because like things
A
that were
dead dog?
yeah, because it died. It died. They couldn't bring it back. They just shot it in space and monitored it. And the poor thing died up there.
That's sad.
Yeah, first living thing in space. Yeah, so
I mean,
a Russian dog. Yeah, I like that. See, it looks like one of our dogs. I don't even mean by our left.
And this is why, if you have a dog like that, never share it with your children. You think that-
Well, not if they're
they didn't have enough technology to bring it back down.
No,
yeah.
So
They wanted to check vitals. They wanted to check to see like
Not circling the earth.
yeah.
A
Wait,
dead dog.
is the dead dog still circling the earth?
most likely.
Probably.
Legend
That's so
has it
sad.
it's still circulating.
The body would be perfectly preserved once the heating wore off,
Yeah.
so.
There's no bacteria. So
Yeah, there's no bacteria.
That's like the
Um,
optimal thing if they're trying to bring anything back to life. That's like the optimal specimen.
Space mummies.
What if he entered
Space
a coma? What if he entered a coma?
the dog would have
I
still
don't-
died.
Pretty sure he would still.
I don't know. 57 was or it was probably like 60 or something when it first that, or
Yeah,
59.
it's been a little bit.
So,
It's probably frozen.
That dog was still alive.
And the thing is, if the insulation gave out,
What if
it would be
time-
frozen, thawed, frozen, thawed, frozen, thawed. I mean, it'd probably.
So, 1957, so that'd be.
Now, Sputnik was unmanned. That was just a satellite. That was just satellite. But yeah, the dog, I think, went up a couple years later.
43 plus 20, so that's 63. So even if the dog was alive, he'd be 63 years old.
It's a lot in dog years.
And then you do 63 times 7,
Too old.
it'd be like,
A vampire.
But I heard that it depends on the breed on the dog year thing. Because like if it's like a big dog, like a Mastiff, it's more like it's a lot less than or no, it's a lot more than 7. You might want to think of it like 10, or something like that.
Whoa.
If it's a longer living breed, then it's going to be less. In any case, okay. Though founded by Eisenhower in 1958, Kennedy called for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. You might have heard that, to put a man on the moon. In 1969, after Kennedy's presidency, Neil Armstrong would be the first man to walk on the moon. Yay, us. JFK wanted to move. Oh, yeah. Moving on from there. So, we are declared the victor of the space race because we both had the intended goal to get people to the moon, right? So they were in the lead, but we kind of sped past them. And that was good because it was a non-violent form of competition. It showed that we could, because the thing is about the Soviets were always like, Americans, you're so backwards with your superstitions and your old ways based on the Enlightenment instead of modern government. And your kids are too busy focusing on religion and things like that instead of science. So we Russians are ahead of you in space race. Well, we proved that American can do these things too. So,
the Americans are better than the
Soviets are pretty much gone now. All right, so moving back to Cuba, JFK wanted to remove Castro from Cuba. Well, yeah, as the communist-run island was only 110 miles from Florida. Under Eisenhower, the plan to get rid of Cuba was being formed, but he had to leave office before this happened. And JFK was like, well, yeah, it's a great idea. Let's try it. Unfortunately, it didn't work out. In 1961, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, our spy network, led the invasion of 1,400 trained Cuban exiles to land at the Bay of Pigs in an attempt to assassinate Castro and free Cuba. And so CIA isn't just about like spy network and gathering information and stuff like that. A lot of what they do is
Central Intelligence Agency.
yeah, a lot of what they do, and they did this also in Afghanistan and Iraq, is they help like special forces, right? Like Green Berets and stuff like that, train friendly people to be foreign fighters for us. So sometimes it's better to use foreigners to do military operations than Americans, is the theory behind it. Well, it didn't work out here in Cuba. Castro always knew that the Americans wanted to get rid of him. They were, I think it only lasted, the invasion only lasted a day, and almost all of these guys were killed or captured. So, not too good.
What is the Cuban Missile Crisis a thing?
It's coming up next. It was a thing. And they think that's the closest we ever got to World War III. So,
Thank you, Magneto.
You ready to move on? Yeah, okay. Here we go. Here's good old lovable Khrushchev there, hugging Castro. And so Castro, of course, being an avowed communist himself, is going to become a good friend with Russia, who's going to help provide him with war supplies and things like that. And in exchange, the Russians are going to ask for some favors as well, which will lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Bay of Pigs was a disaster. All the Cuban exiles were either killed or captured within 3 days by Castro's forces. The CIA would then conduct operations to destroy roads, bridges, and factories within the country while maintaining around 30 assassination attempts on Castro. And Castro would brag about all of these failed assassination attempts for his life. The man, if anything, was very hard to kill. He lived to ripe old age. He died of natural causes.
What?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He died like 12 years ago, maybe a little less. Yeah.
Still in
So-
power?
So I mean, he was. But it goes to show, a lot of times like clandestine stuff like this with like spies and stuff like that, it doesn't always work out. And when it doesn't work out, guess what? The other side gets really super mad whenever you have failed assassinations or failed invasions or stuff like that. They get a little mad. Both America and Russia began nuclear weapons testing again, while the Soviets built a wall to split east from West Berlin. So we are seeing that things are getting more and more distant. One, they're starting to test nukes again. Oh, shoot. We thought we were might get past this. And instead of conducting a plan to rejoin the German people, especially in Berlin, they're like splitting them up with an impenetrable wall topped with razor wire, with a machine gun nest. People get too close. They get ventilated. It's not good. So it was... they even had like minefields and stuff like that to keep the Germans in place. It was like, wow, World War II was a long time ago. It was like the war's been over there for almost 20 years. And they still had, a police state there. Then in 1962, a U-2 spy plane found that nuclear missile sites were under construction in Cuba, right in our backyard. And nuclear missiles fired from the island would be able to arrive in the United States before the military could even react with its own defenses. And they were like, wow, forget mad. We wouldn't even have a chance to get ours up in the air. We would just be ashes and dust. Little crispy critters. Couldn't have that. Especially with two countries that were so like at each other's throats. Completely different ideologies and everything. Ideologies that on purpose opposed one another. That's pretty tough. Everybody really thought that all of the rhetoric and the weapons race and all that stuff was just going to lead to like the loss of all human life. So, scary. Ready to move on? Yeah, remember, the big part of this is Bay of Pigs failed. And we found that the Russians were building nuke sites in Cuba. And so, yeah, that is tough stuff. This is where World War III almost kicked off. And our grandparents would have been in a pretty tough pickle. Let me think. Is my mom born yet? Yeah, I think my mom was like a baby then, so I'm surprised when she is just a wee babe.
When was this?
That was 1962. Well, let me think. No, she was 20. I was born in 80. So yeah, she was like a toddler then. So same with my dad. All right, so here's a map showing the distance in miles to various places. I don't know why Mexico City's on there. I don't know why. I honestly don't know. I think Mexico had always been super neutral in all this. However, it does do good to represent distance. So, like especially like look, Miami, 234 miles. They could have used like primitive Nazi rockets and hit accurately. They could have hit Atlanta with like just dummy rockets, basically giant firecracker rockets, you know. However, with ICBMs, it'd just be like a giant mortar fire. Just go up in space and drop back down. Boop, gone. So, tough stuff there. Tough. The Cuban Missile Crisis continued. Kennedy decided to enact a naval blockade around Cuba and demand removal of these missiles. So he got the Navy to send out aircraft carriers, submarines, of course, battleships, and all that to prevent any boats coming from Russia. It's like, whoa, if they got construction crews building these missile silos, these underground fortresses that would house and protect and fire these missiles, then we got to stop the materials from getting there. Then in October the 22nd of 1962, 180 U.S. warships positioned themselves to stop Russian ships from carrying supplies for the nukes from making it to Cuba, as the Army mustered in Florida and nuclear bombers stayed in the air around the clock. So the idea was, if they do something dumb like nuke us, our planes will already be there. So they were rotating them up in ships and keeping them up there. And I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure by now they could refuel in the air, because nowadays we can refuel these airplanes in the air and keep them in the air for a very long time. And I know we could during the Vietnam War, so maybe they could have around here. Khrushchev decided to give up, averting nuclear war. Thank you. The Limited Test Ban Treaty was created to forbid all but underground nuclear testing. So at least everybody kind of cooled their jets. I mean, of course, nowadays, even underground testing is internationally banned. I'm not sure if you can test in space, though. Maybe not. In Vietnam,
Would they blow up in space? Because you need oxygen for fire.
you can see that, yeah, but I mean, a nuclear reaction isn't about oxygen. The fire is just kind of there, really. I mean,
It's really just a big old wave of energy.
yeah.
It is.
I mean, there wouldn't, like, I don't even know how the shock wave would work without air push. I really don't. But yeah, you could still test the reaction, I would imagine, as destructive as it might be. In Vietnam, the communists had gained control of most of the country. Remember, under Eisenhower, he's like, oh, there's problems in Vietnam, but there's no way I'm going to send my troops there. Well, JFK said, we're going to do it. So he sent 16,000 military advisors to help. Military advisors is a term for when we send troops somewhere, and the whole point is for our troops is to help train and supply their troops without doing the fighting. Sometimes, however, they do fighting though, but it's usually more like not standard military maneuvers. Usually it's things like special forces maneuvers and stuff, or we might let them tell our planes where to bomb or something like that sometimes. But we try to keep our standard forces out of the fight, right? So, but it's usually a sign of escalation. That's why people were a little worried about Syria about 3 or 4 years ago, because we sent military advisors there. Well, actually, even before that, even during Obama, but there still was some fighting going on too. even though we didn't have that many standard troops there. It was mostly like Rangers and Special Forces guys and stuff like that. So, and a lot of their job is to train other people.
What do operators do?
And operators just a standard word for Special Forces guys. But usually, if you're saying somebody's operating, they're usually talking about they're not training other soldiers or something like that. What they're usually doing is they're like going in and they're doing like door kicking and stuff. Think of like SWAT team stuff. So clearing out buildings, maybe arresting people, maybe ventilating them. So.
Because like I know one and he's only home for about half the time, and the other half of the time he is just not.
He's probably is he a National Guard Special Forces guy? Because they do that.
I couldn't tell you if he was even in a branch.
Well, there's a whole bunch of. The thing is, what's funny is like back in the day, there wasn't that much of it. There was only like a few things. There was only Navy SEALs. There was pararescue jumpers in the Air Force, and there was like Green Berets. And then eventually, especially with the War on Terror, they started making a lot. Even the Marines got one. They got one called MARSOC, and then you had all these other ones start breaking up, and it got really big. Got a really big deal. But I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. What's weird though is like, especially when I first got out of the Army, I'd say, "Oh yeah, I just got out of the Army. I was a paratrooper," and so we'd be like, "Oh, wow, I was Special Forces." I'm like, what? It's like I met like 70 guys who told me they used to be Special Forces guys doing all this secret stuff. And I'm sorry, but I don't think everybody I meet was like the world's biggest Rambo. So I think that, like guys will lie so much. Man, guys lie. But anyways, moving on. I'm not saying that guy is, but I'm just saying like I get it all the time, especially like from older guys. Like, well, I might have been a cook, but let's just say I took a few lives. I'm like, what? Like a spoon? Like I don't know.
Out of school? Wait a minute.
With his spoon,
Yeah.
he took out Hitler.
Yeah, I guess so. I couldn't.
No, he's just constantly like over in Afghanistan.
Oh yeah, I believe it. That's that's still going on. Yeah.
In and out of there.
Who shot
And stuff.
JFK?
Lee Harvey Oswald. Now the thing is, though, that was like the world's like luckiest, most magical of shots. They say. Even the bullet, like somehow when it went through his head, ended up in one of these guys' pockets. I think his front jacket pocket, fully intact, and they don't know how it got there. It's like it just went.
Who's JFK's?
One of these guys up here in the car, right? Fell in one of like pocket jackets.
The
Where you
what?
keep a handkerchief, right?
The what fell under?
The bullet.
Oh, the
from his head. I was like, what? So I don't know. There's some weird stuff going on, but yeah, I mean, I tend to believe the official line because I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist. That a crazy guy, Lee Harvey Oswald, shot, and Lee Harvey Oswald was super crazy, super duper crazy. What they're not sure of is if there's like Russian connections to it, because right before he did the assassination, he made his second attempt to actually offer himself to the Russians as like a spy. He actually went to Mexico City, went to the embassy of Russia, because every country had one. He thought if he went to Mexico City, the Americans wouldn't notice, but we did, and they thought he was super crazy and turned away. But he would come back later to shoot Kennedy. What his motives were, I don't know. I don't know if he just thought he was just going to stick it to America, if he wanted to be famous. But he was assassinated himself after he was arrested. So we just don't know. He shot a president and then he died. And we're like, oh, shoot. And since he was like a loner, we didn't really get a lot of information from him. So, seeing his popularity dip with his own party, JFK decided to visit Dallas in order to gain support from Southern Democrats. Because you remember back then, the Democrat Party was pretty divided. You had Southern Democrats, Northern Democrats. Northern Democrats were a lot like the Republicans. And the Southern Democrats were still pro-segregation and more concerns were like agriculture and stuff like that. On November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald, leaving the nation stunned. Kennedy's vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, became president. Johnson entered office determined to reform the country as a whole. He saw the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which made discrimination illegal for all businesses. And so it's from the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that you're going to have a whole lot of other legislation is going to come up as far as personal business practices. This is going to be one of the first times where Congress is going to make rules on who people can and cannot serve as a private business. And so it's extended beyond racial things since then. And it's based on essentially, I think the 15th Amendment, which, if you remember, was kind of like equal rights for all U.S. citizens, a constitutional amendment. But instead of just for the government, now it's also for private businesses. That's why if you like run a McDonald's, you can't tell people who are from like, I don't know, a country you don't like for some reason that they can't have their chicken nuggets. So, all right. He also declared a war on poverty and initiated the Great Society social program. So, like we talked about before, we had like the New Deal and stuff like that. The Great Society is his platform issue. It's a social program to expand education, civil rights, and government jobs, environmentalism, and welfare programs such as Medicare and Medicaid. And so this is where we're going to see a lot of these things like public housing and stuff like that. It's going to be with Lyndon B. Johnson. The whole idea is by, which is something that's kind of new to do it on this scale. If you remember, FDR did something similar during the Great Depression. Lyndon B. Johnson is going to see the civil rights movement as a similar thing to the Great Depression. He's like, well, if we're going to make sure everybody is on equal footing, then we need to provide a lot of programs for those underclass people to become like everybody else. Now, was it effective or not? Well, that's up for y'all to figure it out. But many of these programs are still around today, like Medicare and Medicaid and all that stuff. Of course, the Rights Act and all that. So, man, it's almost been 45 minutes. I don't think we're going to make it through Vietnam. I can't do it next week because we got to start with the next semester. We are going to get through it, though. We are. We just might have to put a pause button on it and just come back to it in a few months. That means we're going to have to move faster next semester. And like, I don't mean like water it down, but I'm just going to have to move faster. Let me see what's next. Okay, we're going to do 2 more slides. That'll bring us right up to Vietnam. But the irony of it all is that Lyndon B. Johnson is doing all of these things, most of these programs for civil rights for African Americans and other racial groups that have been disparaged over time. But it's also during his presidency is where we're going to have the most racial unrest up until probably pretty recently, right? With all the ever since Ferguson and all that. So, if you watch the news. All right, so let's go ahead and move on. So, here we see M1 Garand and a bayonet. All right. So, this is where we're going to start seeing the spread of even more race riots in America. There had been race riots before, but a lot of the times in the past, especially after the Civil War, race riots were usually by people who used to be slave owners or fought for the Confederacy, and they would do lynchings and stuff like that. Here, though, during this period of LBJ, it's going to be the other way around. Now it's going to be, you can say like the tables have turned in a sense. So, America divided under Johnson. In many parts of America, people became disenchanted with nonviolent strategy in the civil rights movement. So people were saying, Martin Luther King Jr., you're too slow. We need to move faster. This whole thing of just marching peacefully in the streets doesn't give us enough. Yeah. So race riots broke out in Los Angeles, the Watts riots in 1965, and Detroit, 1967, were stark examples to the 300 plus riots that occurred throughout cities during Johnson's administration. So a lot of cities were burning. This is during a time where there was a lot of murdering and looting. A lot of shop owners and homeowners were literally on their roofs with their neighbors, with their rifles to make sure that the rioters didn't come and burn down their stuff. It was all over the news all the time. And on the inverse, some people were afraid of the rioters destroying their homes, but other people were scared of the police. So it was like you had this war going on within America. A lot of Americans truly believed and were very scared at this time of the idea of a race war. Like they thought there would be a civil war divided along racial lines. Though he won a Nobel Peace Prize, Martin Luther King was shouted down after many of these riots for not going far enough. A lot of the rioters wanted him to join them. So you're going to have a division in the civil rights movement called the Black Power movement. And in this, you're going to have the Black Panthers emerge. They're going to come from California. They largely start out as street gangs, money dealing drugs, but they're going to become very racialized and idealized. They're eventually they're going to send their members into the military to learn how to fight, and then when they come home, they do things like travel state lines and assassinate police officers in the middle of the night and stuff like that. So they were doing acts that today we'd call terrorism. The Nation of Islam also formed as well, which it's a black only group that has a very unique twist to Islam that they follow. They're largely nonviolent though, right? So they have a lot of rhetoric. They live very austere lives and they like to be isolated, right, from society. They deem society as something evil that has like a racial taint they don't want part of, and so they just make their own communities. Martin Luther King continued to call for reform and nonviolence, but was assassinated on April the 4th, 1968. And of course, a couple of Mondays from now, we will have Martin Luther King Jr. Day in remembrance of him. We'll do one more slide. We'll call it a day. So yeah, poor guy. He tried. He stuck to his guns. He was a true believer in nonviolence, Christian temperance, and all that. But the movement kind of took different paths. You know what I'm saying? Now there were a lot of people. He's a very popular guy, right? But in many ways, he became a martyr. You know, because of the assassination. And so we still remember him today. Whereas you could say like the opposite of him was Malcolm X, right? So he didn't necessarily call for violence, but what Malcolm X did was whereas Martin Luther King Jr. was like, love your neighbor, Malcolm X was like, I hate my neighbor because he hates me. So we don't even need to be part of the same society. So. All right, last one.
What a lot of people are doing now.
Yeah, well, let's hope people don't divide too much. Unity is really one thing that keeps us from being violent. I mean, the same thing, it's human nature. It's not only groups of people, but it even happens in like couples. They say that couples who divorce, they become more and more distant and they don't realize it. And when you're more distant from people, often you kind of think about them in more paranoid terms. You know, does that make sense? Like you think, you're not talking, so you're kind of guessing. Well, she must have did this because she must really be blah 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 blah. You know, so that's why like if you want to keep relationship with somebody, you don't smother them, please, but gotta talk. Gotta have time with each other. All right, last one. A changing America. The 60s emerged as a time of great change and counterculture for many Americans. So we talked a bit about counterculture. So the counterculture, of course, was I'm gonna have to make slides on it later, but it's pretty easy to see with like the hippie movement. So here you're gonna have people who are gonna like check out of society, move away from like standard family norms, of course, drug use, You're also going to have, during this time period, non-fault divorce is going to crop up. That's where it's legal for people to divorce just because they want to. Before this time, people had to have a reason to divorce, like adultery or abuse, or like crazy stuff like that. You're also going to see people are going to be more open to marital sex, stuff like that. Hippie movement influenced nation's youth to turn away from their parents' values and to live in alternative lifestyles. Of course, overdoses and STDs also went up during this time as well as a consequence, right? So the 1960s was also defined by the Supreme Court rulings during what's known as the Warren Court. He was the Chief Justice during this time. And they're going to uphold a lot of the reforms, the social reforms to America, especially civil rights ones. Like I told you, all three branches of the federal government was on board for the civil rights movement. So it was a very on the top kind of thing. You had people in the streets, but at the same time, you had the federal government all for it. The Warren Court viewed the Constitution as it applied to modern times. So they're not this is the first time we have a non-originalist interpretation court. So they don't look necessarily to see what the founders thought. They look to see how the text is applied in today's terms. And so that's why you had some things come up had never been viewed in the Constitution, like abortion. The court banned religion in schools, though it had never been done before. The nation was almost 200 years, and it was a question that did not come up. They freed communist prisoners. So if you were a communist, you couldn't go to prison for your ideas anymore, even if your ideas were like, hey, we need to destroy America. Legalized pornography and made other sweeping changes. So you see that the old ways of the 50s, leave it to Beaver, is kind of getting left in the trash cans. Now we're having a lot of things that people in the 50s would have been aghast by. Now all of a sudden, we're being legalized in a more liberal way in many ways in America. So,
Okay, wait. So
60s.
what does it mean when it says view the Constitution as it applied to modern times, not according to my
Okay. So this is where it goes all the way back to the days of what was his name? Wilson. Remember President Wilson, right? His whole doctoral thesis was on the idea that the Constitution was a living document to where your interpretation of that document may change. And so one generation might read the law this way, but the next two generations might read that same text and say the law actually applies to this in a completely different way. And so as long as you're able to explain it well enough, like a lawyer often does with law, then it's justified. And the Supreme Court being the Supreme Court of the land that can interpret, their interpretation of the Constitution is supposed to be the authoritative one. Nobody else is supposed to have a different one and act that way in the law. So they're like, hey, we view this as differently. So some things, and a lot of it goes back to the 15th Amendment, number 13, 14, 15th Amendments, the amendments that we gained after the end of the Civil War. So freed slaves, made them citizens, gave them the right to vote and protect their civil rights. Now, when the 15th Amendment was made in the debates, and when it was voted on, they specifically said it was for the slaves, but it's not in the text. Because it's not in the text of the amendment, they took the 15th Amendment and they were able to apply that civil rights could also mean freeing communist prisoners, stuff like that. The 15th Amendment is also used to justify, like, say, Roe v. Wade, and things like that. So it's been that way ever since. So it's not what the intention of the people who made the law was. It's what the law says and how we think it should apply. So that's the new. There are still originalists in the court, so there is a division. That's why you never know when the court's going to go this way or another. All right, folks, that's going to end our lecture for today, and I'll see you Monday. All right. Yeah, because we are going to have class Monday.